Having dealt with an overview of the Greek verbal system in the previous segment, today we're going to jump right in and actually begin to look at two of the tenses in terms of our understanding of them, as well as, and most importantly, how we recognize them within the verbal system. And so today we take a look at the present and future active indicative verbal forms. As we do so, let's begin first of all by just talking briefly about the verb. What is a verb? Well, a verb typically expresses action. All right? Pretty general statement, but that's a pretty general idea. The woman writes a thesis. Notice the subject is doing an action. That's one of the ways that we see the verb functioning in both Greek, as is the case in English. It also can express a state. Notice here, the man is a graduate student. All right, notice that this particular sentence isn't describing an action. It's talking about the state in which the subject finds himself. Now, basically what we're talking about, and whenever we're dealing with a verb, is that a verb expresses the relation between two things, the subject and the direct object. Okay? And it expresses that relationship from the subject to the direct object. Now, there are different verbs, of course, that we find. There are things that we call transitive verbs that take a direct object. I do want to say that there are also verbs that we call intransitive verbs. Those are verbs that stand alone. They don't need a direct object to fill them out in terms of meaning or in terms of understanding. He died is a good example of an intransitive verb. Okay? So working with those kinds of things should give us an understanding of how we understand verbs within the Greek verbal system. Okay? As we look at this particularly, let's move quickly to the present tense. And in this discussion, in both the present tense and the future, I'm going to move from talking from the conceptual framework of each tense to talking about the recognition factor for each tense. In the present tense, we've already seen in previous segments that its aspect normally describes a progressive kind of action. Or it can also say nothing at all about the verb's aspect, the summary aspect. That's the second translation that I gave you in the previous segment. The first one, pointing to the progressive aspect, I am studying. Looks at it, the action from an internal point of view, and talks about it and envisions it and portrays it as it unfolds. All right? But there are certain verbs in both English and Greek that simply take on a summary kind of translation. All right? I study Greek, as well as let me go back with that. What I was trying to say was, I am studying Greek would be a progressive translation. All right? I study Greek would be more of a summary. And verbs, depending upon their lexical nature and their lexical force, we'll talk more about this, are more comfortably being translated into English in one or the other way. What you always do need to look at is how the present tense gets at this internal kind of perspective and to begin to fill out what that may mean and what the author is attempting to portray. Now, we also saw that in terms of time, it does describe an action that can occur in the present time, and that's assuming that you're in the indicative mood, right? Time is not an issue outside of the indicative mood, the imperative, the subjunctive, the optative mood. So only in the indicative mood are you going to be able to look at the issue of time. But even there, as you'll see in just a moment, it does not function, that being time, it does not function in an absolute kind of manner. So the thing I want you to pick up here is the present tense points to the progressive aspect, portraying that action from an internal perspective, seeing it as it develops. And at times, when it's in the indicative mood, it can point to a present temporal context. All right, this is a good example from Scripture of the present tense where it does point to that issue of present action. Notice Matthew 8:25, Lord, save us, sosan. Then apalumetha, we are perishing. Notice what the present tense is getting across there is that In this present time, there is something that's going on, and they are in the midst of it. They're viewing this as they are perishing. And therefore, we are perishing paints a picture for you as to what the author was trying to portray by the use of the present tense here. All right, let's look at another example, because the rest of the examples move a little bit beyond a basic understanding. Notice here, it also is in the present time frame, but it's a little bit different. Notice child, teknon, aphientai, su hai hamartiai. Son, your sins are forgiven. All right. Notice that in the context here, the writer, even though this is a present tense, isn't simply getting at a progressive idea. There's a sense in which the action pushes you to understand your sins are forgiven as if it's taking place now, but it's also coming to fruition now. And so it's not unfolding endlessly. It's unfolding, but then also comes to completion. There's not something in the present tense that identifies that for you. It's the context of the passage that helps you work through some of the different nuances within tense usage and tense translation. All right? And so the present tense in the indicative mood normally focuses on present kinds of time contexts. But, just so you know, put this in the back of your mind, it can also be used differently in the indicative mood. Like, to point to a future action. Notice, behold, I am sending my messenger before you. This coming in a prophetic context there in Mark chapter 1, 2. Notice as we're looking at this present tense, we translated it as a present, didn't we? And an indicative form. I am sending. But when you think about that action, it's actually going to happen in the future, isn't it? I am sending. It's something that projects into the future. So this is a little bit different than the previous two examples that we've looked at. And I give it to you simply to show that there are contexts where the present tense can point more to a future coming as opposed to something in the present. Just keep that in the back of your mind. And then lastly, I know this might be hard to believe, but the present tense can also be used in certain contexts to describe past action. And we'll talk more about this when we get into it and see it in terms of examples. But Mark 1:12 is a good basic one. All right. If I were to simply read this in a rudimentary kind of way, I would say immediately the Spirit is driving him into the wilderness. All right. That would be the present progressive, right? Well, it just so happens that this is taking place in a narrative context, a story context, and sometimes the present tense can be used, all right, to refer to past action. And when it does, it accentuates that verbal action. And in so doing, draws great attention to it. It carries more semantic weight, if you will. We'll talk more about that later. Just to show you here that there are certain occasions where the present tense can take a past tense translation. And immediately, the Spirit drove him into the wilderness. This is what some grammars would call the historical use of the present tense. Okay? But most of all, mostly, when you're coming across a present tense form, although there are some exceptions, you need to look at the present tense as pointing to a progressive aspect and begin to think about what that would mean for the verbal action that you're looking at. And in addition, if you're in the indicative mood, to at least begin to think about the issue of time, most of it being in the present, but being open to the idea that depending upon the context, it could very well point to a future or even to a past action. Okay? Now, moving from the concept of the present tense to how we recognize it. Okay? Just some introductory kinds of things here. It's important to know that whenever you come across a verbal form in the New Testament, the one thing that you want to think about is the fact that you're going to be able to reduce that form down to a basic stem. Okay? All of your Greek forms are going to have a basic stem that you're working with. And what that Greek verb is going to do is, depending upon its tense, voice, mood, person, and number, it's either going to add things to the beginning of that stem, things to the middle of the stem, or things to the end of the stem to orient you to how you are to understand that action and how you are to translate that action. I like to describe this as putting on clothing. All right? I think of myself as a basic stem, if you will, if I am a Greek verb. And in order to express different ideas, in order to express and portray and present different kinds of understandings, that being verbal understandings, I'm going to add clothing either to the front of that stem, I'm going to add clothing to the middle and maybe change the stem, or I'm going to add clothing to the end so that you are able to clearly come to an understanding in your mind of how I want to portray that action. All right? So it's like putting on clothing of that Greek verbal stem, and depending upon the clothing will point you in the direction of how you are to understand the action as well as how you are to translate it. Okay? Let's look at how we recognize the present active indicative of this verb luo. Luo simply meaning I am loosing. First and foremost, you identify the stem. The stem of luo is lu. Now, let me give you a little bit of an understanding here. Whenever you're trying to identify a stem, okay, and let me go to the Elmo here just for a moment. Whenever you're trying to identify the stem of a verb, remember, I told you in the previous segment that the lexical form of a verb, the way you find a verb in the standard lexicon, is always its present active indicative first singular form. And therefore, the first singular form is going to take either an omega ending, an omai ending, or a me ending. Many times, when you're working with present tense verb forms, it's easy to find the stem by simply cutting off that omega, or that amai, or that me. Most times, if you cut off that omega, you actually will reduce that verb to its stem. As we walk through exercises, I'll show you the cases where that's not simply true. But most of the time it is. So when you're looking at the verbs in your exercises for chapter 3 in black, most of those you can identify the stem by simply slicing off the clothing that has been added to the end of that stem, the omega. Okay? Just a little hint. And so we break it down according to its basic stem. The stem of luo is lu. And for the present active indicative, we simply add clothing, endings, if you will, to the end of that particular stem. Okay? Now, these are paradigms you just simply need to memorize, and you need to be able to recall on a moment's notice. And so I would encourage you, as you're working through these different endings, to go ahead and begin to put them to memory, doing something like this. Present active indicative, oase, amenete, usi. Okay? Something I can just return to time and time again. The omega is the present active indicative form for the first person singular. The ace is the present active indicative ending for the second person singular. For the third person singular and the present active indicative, it's an a ending, the diphthong. First person plural for the present active indicative, amen. Second person plural, ete. And third person plural, usi. And at times, you'll find what's called a movable nu on the end of that, if the next word in the progression of the Greek sentence begins with a vowel or a diphthong. Okay? So those are the actual endings for the present active indicative. O, ace, a, amen, ete, usi. All right. Now, translation once again, since you're in the present active indicative, it's present, so your aspect's going to be progressive. It's active, so your subject is going to be doing the action. It's indicative, and so there is a time element involved. I, you, he, she, or it, we, y'all, or they are loosing. Okay? That gets at that full picture of what an author is trying to describe by using the present active indicative form. Now, let's go ahead and add this clothing to the actual verb of luo and see how it breaks down. Oh, I didn't give you that. And so we'll actually go back and let me at least describe it to you. If we were to put these particular verbs on the list, this is what it would look like. Going to the Elmo, we take our stem. All right, we take our stem, lu. All right. And for the first person singular, luo, lues, lue. Those are the first, second, and third person singular. For the plural, luamen. You can see that there. Luamen. Luete. And then lastly here, third person plural, luusi. Sometimes with a movable nu. Okay? Translation. I am loosing. You are loosing. He is loosing. We are loosing. Y'all are loosing. Yep, Jesus was a southerner. Y'all were loosing. And then they are loosing. All right. I am loosing. You are loosing. He, she, or it is loosing. We are loosing. Y'all are loosing. And they are loosing. Puts together how we would recognize those, actually put those endings on the stem itself, as well as how we would go about translating them. Okay? Now, moving on to the future tense. As we've already seen, the future tense itself has an especially vague aspect, if you will. It at times describes nothing at all about the verb's aspect. All right? But it can also describe a progressive aspect from time to time. But it's the summary that really gets at the heart of what we're talking about here in the future tense. When you're in the indicative mood, it can describe an action in the future. This is that particular tense that points us to the issue of expectation. So when you're in the indicative mood, normally it points you in that way. And normally the point of expectation looks at the issue of the future time. Okay? As we look at this, though, the future tense can also function in some different kinds of ways. One of the ways that you'll find the future tense functioning in the Greek New Testament is to predict or to point to something in the future. Notice here in Mark 1:3b, talking this prophecy from Isaiah, where the text says, saying, "Who will prepare your way? I am sending this messenger before you who will prepare your way." All right, well, the future orientation there comes across in the future tense in the Greek verbal system, just as it would in the English system. So it's used to predict action. It's also used to translate a number of the Old Testament law verses. You'll know what I'm talking about right here, like in Matthew 22:37. Agapeses is a future tense form. You shall love the Lord your God. That's an Old Testament law that we see from time to time, isn't it? And therefore, many times, a law is translated with the future tense. You shall love the Lord your God. Another way, you will love the Lord your God. Will gets a little bit more at the issue of volition. Shall leaves it a little bit behind volition. It tells you what you ought to do. Okay? Many times that's described, since it's focused on expectation, and given to you in a future tense form in the Greek system. It also has some other temporal kinds of ranges, though. Future tense can be used to describe a timeless kind of action. Note this example in Romans 5:7. Hardly will someone die for just a person. Your verb in that situation is actually in the future tense. But notice how it's not just talking about something future. It's talking about really a timeless perspective, isn't it? Rarely will someone actually die for another. That's not so much focused on the issue of time and a future time as much as it is true for all time. Okay? The future can get at that. And certain grammars call that the gnomic future use. It can also point to something that's omnitemporal, okay, in the future. Notice as we're working with this, Mark 2:22 is a good example. The wine will tear the wineskins. All right, notice that this isn't just pointing to something that's going to happen in the future. This is really telling you something that you can expect. All right, this is something that is going to happen. All right, and so it's kind of beyond time. It's omnitemporal. The future can also work in that way as well. The emphasis here, though, as far as the basic future tense, you want to identify that it functions with really a summary kind of aspect. All right, it just talks about an event in its entirety from an external perspective. And when you're in the indicative mood, it can point to future kinds of time. But as we just saw in these examples, it also goes beyond that to point to times, a context which may be timeless or even omnitemporal. Okay? But default, go with the former that I talked to you about. Now, how about the recognition factor in the Greek for the future active indicative of luo? Just like we did with the present active indicative, you're going to work from the basic stem of the verb. But guess what? You're going to have different endings. You're going to put different clothing on the end of the future active indicative than you did with the present active indicative so that you can tell them apart. But the good news is, there's only going to be one component that's different, but different enough to show you the difference. All right, the key thing for the future active indicative is noticing the addition of clothing that includes a sigma. All right? You recognize those endings? They're the ones that you just memorized for the present active indicative. Oese, amen, eteuse. But notice what the future active indicative adds to it in order to make it stand out from the present. A sigma. Okay? By placing that sigma before each of those pieces of clothing, it orients you to the future active indicative over and against the present. All right? So, seis, say, samen, sete, susi. Okay? So being your first person singular, seis being your second person singular, your third person singular, say, first person plural, samen, sete being your second person plural, susi, of course, being your third person plural, once again, at times, with the movable nu when it shows up. All right, the translation here, first singular, I will loose. You will loose for the second singular. Third singular, he, she, or it will loose. We will loose for the first person plural. You all will loose for the second person plural. And then finishing out here, the third person plural, they will loose. All right? As you work on these particular words, going back over to the Elmo here, notice you simply add these as we did before. You take the stem of luo and you add the endings. First person singular, luso. Second person singular, luces. Third person singular, luce. First person plural, lusamen. Second person plural, lucete. And then second person plural, third person plural, lususi. Okay? Adding the future active indicative clothing directly to the stem of the verb luo. Okay? Now, a couple things I just need to point out to you quickly. I'm going to move through these really quickly because they're also in your text, but I do need to mention them. When the stem of a future verb ends in a consonant, a phonological change will occur when the future time morpheme is attached, such as your P, your beta, and your phi. Whenever those come into contact, let me say it this way, whenever those are at the end of a verbal stem and they come into contact with the sigma, they amalgamate to the psi. Blepo is a good example of that. Notice the P at the end of the stem. When you put a future active indicative ending on it, it goes to the psi, blepso. All right? It's important to note that because otherwise you wouldn't see a sigma, would you, there? So noting the amalgamation enables you to identify that as a future active indicative over and against a present active indicative. Kappas, gammas, keys, when those come into contact with sigmas, they amalgamate to a xi. Notice the verb dioko. It ends in a kappa. So when you go to put a future active indicative ending on that, the kappa amalgamates to a xi, dioxo, future active indicative, first person singular. And then dentals, taus, deltas, thetas, and zetas. Whenever these come into contact at the end of a stem with the sigma, they simply drop out altogether. They get out of there. And all you are left with is the sigma. And so you'll see a little bit of a difference in the stem, won't you? But the sigma followed by the endings will point you to the future tense. All right. Patho is a good example of this. Ending in the theta, when the sigma comes into contact with that in the future active indicative, the theta drops out. Peso is your future active indicative first person singular form. All right, the last thing I just want to point out to you, and I'm going to put these on the screen and move beyond, is a very important verb that you'll see popping up again and again, and you simply have to memorize it just as you do the other endings and clothing for the tenses. Okay? This is the present indicative of the verb eimi. Eimi is the Greek verb that translates in English to simply I am or you are. All right? It describes a basic state. All right? Eimi is the first person singular form. We would identify that as a present active indicative, first person singular, eimi. Present active indicative, second person singular, a. Third person singular, present active indicative, esti. First person plural, present active indicative, esmen. Second person plural of the present active indicative, este. And then third person plural of the present active indicative, ac. Put these to memory because when you see them in exercises or even in the Greek text, you'll need to be able to recognize them by memory and translate them accordingly. Eimi, I am. A, you are. Esti, he, she, or it is. As men, we are. Este, y'all are. And then AC, they are. All right. I want to draw your attention in the text to the way we negate a particular sentence. In the indicative mood, it's with the negation u. Outside of the indicative mood, we'll get to these later in future segments, is may. 3 examples, and you can find these in your book as well. U luo, I do not loose. And then also with the negations, when they come before, when u comes before a particular verb that begins with a vowel, with a smooth breathing mark, it adds a kappa to the end of it. So u goes to uk. They mean the same thing. It's just making a compensation when it comes to pronunciation. So uk akuo, I do not hear. Uk hetoimazo, notice etoimazo has a rough breathing mark on it. So the hetoimazo, whenever you have the u coming into contact with a verb beginning with a vowel or diphthong with a rough breathing mark, it doesn't go to the kappa, it actually goes to the key. All right? I do not prepare. All right, now as you're working with these here, it's just important to note that whether you're dealing with u, uk, or uk, they're all negations. And they're a simple way of negating the verbal action in the sentence itself. And look for these negations to come prior to the verb in the sentence. Okay? All right, as we move to the end of the process, I just want to walk through some things for you as it relates to our understanding of parsing Greek present and future tense verbs. Okay? And I just want to work through these quickly for you because you're going to be able to work through them as well. This is in worksheet number 3 in your syllabus packet, and it looks simply like this. Okay? As we work on this together, remember, I'm wanting you to go through and parse each verb. You need to parse each verb in order to translate each verb. Remember, in parsing, you need to identify its tense, voice, mood, its person and its number, and its lexical form. Once you've done that, you can actually translate it. So let's do that together quickly here with a couple of these. I'll just pick out a couple and then I'll let you practice with the rest, and you can get back with me if you have questions on particular ones. Akuo is our first one. Akuo comes from the verb akuo. That is its lexical form. Okay? If I'm going to get the stem of that verb, I'm just going to cut off that omega at the end. All right? And then I'm going to say what's left. Well, what's left is the O. If I know my endings, oase, amen, ete, usi, I know that that is a present active indicative first person singular form. Once I know that, then I can translate it according to aspect and according to time, since we are in the indicative mood here. Translation, I am hearing. And this is a good one for us to look at, because notice that this particular verb is not really well suited to be translated in a progressive fashion. This is one of those verbs that has a particular lexical force that probably, when we translate it into English, although we would look at its aspect, we would translate it as I hear. I am hearing is a bit awkward. It's because of its lexical nature. All right, so that's the first one. Notice the second one here. Uk, aku, usi. All right, this is again from the verb akuo. All right, its stem is going to be aku, which means I have an usi ending. Okay? As I work back through my endings thus far, the usi ending is a present active indicative third person plural form. All right? If I were to translate this, I would translate it as what? According to its aspect and according to its time, I would translate it, they are hearing, or they hear. The only difference with this particular example is, notice, you've got a negation. So, I am not hearing. You could also say, I do not hear. Okay? Notice, you've got the form of u that has the kappa on the end, because the next word begins with a vowel with a smooth breathing mark. If it were a rough breathing mark, that ook would have gone to ook with the key. All right, let's look at the third one here. Akuses comes from the verb I see as akuo. All right, if that's my lexical form, I knock off the omega. Notice, I see that the clothing that has been added to this particular form of akuo is a sigma, epsilon iotis, sigma. Well, as I think back through the clothing that I've memorized thus far, I know it's not present active indicative because those don't begin with sigma, do they? It's got to be your future active indicative. This is your future active indicative form, second person what? It's going to be your second person singular form, seis. Remember your breakdown? So, seis, say, salmon, salmon, sete, susi. Seis comes at that future active indicative, second person singular form. Translation, I will hear. Okay, I will hear. Okay, let me do two more with you so that we don't abuse our time here. But let me do two more so that you can make some specific kinds of notes as it relates to these things. I'm going to move on now to number 6. Usozamen. All right, sozamen comes from the verb, once I know my verb and I've learned my vocabulary, from sozo, means I save. If I knock off that omega, giving me the stem, I notice that the clothing that's been added to this particular verbal form is amen. As I think back through the endings that I've memorized, osa, amen, ete, usi, what is it? Present active indicative, first person, plural form, right? First person plural. I would translate it, we are saving. All right, in order to get at that present understanding. We are saving. Notice, though, it does have a negation on the beginning, doesn't it? This negation does not have a kappa or a key. Why? I'm sure you're right. It's because the next word begins in a consonant. Okay? But with the negation, we've got to negate the sentence. So instead of I'm saving, we are saving, it would be we are not saving. Okay? We are not saving. Now let's go on to number 7, the final one that we'll deal with here. All right. I can see that it looks like it comes from sozo, okay, which means that something's changed, hasn't it? If sods is the stem, where is the zeta? And how do I account for the sigma and the omega ending? Well, it could just be a present active indicative first person singular, I am saving, but if that were the case, it would have the zeta there, wouldn't it? Well, this is one of those places where future tense amalgamation comes into play, okay? And in so doing, the sots stem, when you've gone to place the sigma omega ending on it, the future active indicative first person singular form, whenever that sigma came in contact with the zeta, well, look back to your list. What happens when a zeta comes into contact with a sigma? It drops out altogether. Therefore, you're left with so-so. This is your future active indicative first person singular form. And how do you translate the future? I will save. Okay? All right, well, I'm going to leave the rest for you to do. I think I've given you enough at least to see how you walk through the actual parsing of a Greek verb, how you work through its recognition, and then also how you move on to translate it in a particular sentence. Go ahead and do the rest of these, and then move on to the exercises in the chapter. And you'll be well on your way to mastering the future and the present active indicative. See you in the next segment.